Well, good morning. I've obviously expressed my good tidings of the morning to each one of you individually beforehand, but just as a group, I want to thank you all very, very much for coming to this workshop. Literally, we have people here from all over the world, and although we're a small group, I'm hoping that in sharing our ideas today, and those of you who will be participating in the following days, in sharing ideas, we can not only build intellectual bridges, but we can make some progress in the very exciting field of evaluating progress made in megatransport project planning and appraisal in different parts of the world. Everyone has now more or less been introduced to each other, so I won't go around all the different people to make those introductions. What I'll do instead is to explain to you what I hope to do today. But before I even do that, I have to, I understand, fulfill some obligations here on behalf of Ariba to let you know that, let me see, there are, in case of fire, Phil, I'm obliged to do this, am I? I'm obliged legally to read this out. If you discover a fire, if you discover a fire, operate the nearest fire alarm, dial 4000 and report the location to the fire to the reception. They will then inform the emergency services and follow the fire exit. We're not talking about risk yet here, but on hearing the fire alarm, a continuous ringing bell will be heard. Leave the building by the nearest fire exit. Do not stop to collect any personal belongings. Close all doors behind you. Assemble in Bridford Mews, assuming you know where that is, at the back of the main building. The main emergency exit, turn left when you leave the room. You won't remember this. Follow the fire exit signs down the stairs and exit to the Weymouth Street. Turn left out of the fire exit. Take first left onto Hallam Street, and then left to Devonshire Street, and then first left onto the Bridford Mews, which is the assembly point. Okay, you got that? If you're really interested, I can put this in the proceedings. Today we have a collection of contributions that is the first actually of several. We will hold a workshop of this kind next year as well. Contributions from a variety of disciplines, sectors and professions, looking at the treatment of complexity, risk and uncertainty in decision making for purposes of planning. I think that's perhaps the... Now this coverage, this scope, emerges from a small project that we at the Berkeley School of Planning were successful in gaining funding for from Volvo prior to being awarded the Centre of Excellence budget, which declared as its aim the need really to examine what other disciplines and professions were achieving in the field of understanding the art and science of decision making in climates of high uncertainty, where risks are common, and where risk-taking and uncertainty has long time been the milieu of decision-making, and where problems have been acknowledged to be complex. The thought was that all these characteristics, complexity, uncertainty, risk-taking, are actually very much part of what planners of infrastructure and city regions have said they have been involved in for a great period of time. The truth of the matter is, if you look at the literature of city and regional planning, there is very little intellectual depth about this field. And without flattering John Adams too much, I have to say that he is one of the few people in the field that has brought attention to this to our fraternity. Meanwhile, those in the security fields and military fields from which John Stone Imperial comes in terms of his academic area, of course, have been dealing with risk, uncertainty and complexity as part of everyday survival, literally. The military, this is they live and breathe these concepts and operationalize them. More recently, in the field of agriculture and environmental field, with bird flu, with BSE, with a number of issues, we've seen in the environmental field and in agriculture the importance of risk, understanding risk, the complexity of contagious diseases, the decisions being made in amongst all this complexity, and an acknowledgement that really, even though problems are complex, we can't afford academics to neatly chop up these areas into convenient intellectual bags of knowledge in order for them to write articles, but instead have to acknowledge that there is a set of interconnecting, very, very complex relationships that we need to make better sense of. And in that regard, sense-making of complexity is really a contribution that I would acknowledge you to read on, written up by David Snowden, who unfortunately cannot be here today and was due to be our second contributor. David Snowden's work was previously at IBM, where this whole issue of understanding complexity and coping with it really led to the belief that you needed to make sense of complexity rather than answer clear questions. And furthermore, in his work on narrative pattern analysis, which we will be looking at, those of us who move on in the following days in our workshop, it is acknowledging the fact that knowledge and expertise lies outside of the experts as well. That the experts, to rely on the experts, and this is Malcolm Gladwell's message as well, as it is David, I can never pronounce the guy's name, so I shouldn't have really mentioned him, as the Wisdom of Crowds. This was the author of this book, which argues really that if you leave specialists to solve problems, you're generating problems of a very specialized kind. And in that regard, it acknowledges that there's knowledge that has to be harnessed and understood and sense made of in the public at large. And narrative pattern analysis goes to storytelling of, in our case, big projects by people who are impacted by it rather than the engineers and designers and planners. And so bringing in an understanding of complexity from outside the expert field is another area of development that we hopefully will be looking at. What I've tried to do with the help of Richard and Caroline and my other colleagues in this particular project is to draw from the articles that John, the commission papers that just so happens that all three Johns here today are writing. Mike Batty unfortunately can't be here, but he's also written a paper which can be made available. The idea is that we extract, if you like, the intellectual juices from these different fields and spheres and then try and examine their usefulness for mega project planning, appraisal and evaluation. And that was the intention behind this. I suspect we've probably chewed off more than we can quite cope with here, having commented on just a few of the papers. Fascinating as they may be, that there are many, many implications of transfer or lesson sharing here from other fields that really make the field of mega transport planning look fairly crude, actually, but perhaps I'm jumping ahead of myself. That's the background in terms of what we're trying to do, what we're trying to achieve here. The first task was actually to examine some of the terminology and the concepts that surround the terminology of risk-taking, complexity, uncertainty, moving into concepts which Richard will be talking about wicked problems. One thing that we very, very quickly became aware of, which is quite obvious, but nevertheless needs to be emphasized is the importance of context. Is that all these terms and the values that attach to them are different according to where you are in time, where you are geographically, where you are culturally, where you are politically. And so as a result of that, if you like, the complexity of understanding complexity becomes even more wicked. You begin to realize at the end of the day that this is a hugely difficult arena to make sense of, which is why, to conclude, perhaps we find politicians, in particular civil servants to a degree, wanting to present complex problems as simple issues, and why journalists, similarly so, really don't want intellectual acrobatics taking place presented to them in order to understand the real world. And the difficult task we have here in this project is how do we, once we even understood a proportion of what we've set out to undertake, to understand, how we then translate our findings in a way that politicians, policymakers can learn from our knowledge development. Because if, for sure, we communicate our findings in a complex manner, we will alienate them and we will not influence. And even though all of us here, almost all of us here, are from academic institutions, let me declare from the outset that my purpose is not to engage with other academics alone. The purpose of this research and the work that goes with it is to influence the field of operations and inform and help inform policymakers, technocrats, to take a different view on things than they have in the past, or a wider view.